So here we are. We just completed our 3D model and we're excited to show it off online. Because of our excitement, we end up rushing one of the most important parts of the 3D art pipeline, which is rendering with cameras and lights. Here are a couple examples of what it looks like when you rush your rendering. This has bad composition, framing, lighting, you name it. This may look like an exaggerated example, but you see this online quite a bit. But here's what the renders can look like just by spending a little bit of time setting up and using a simple lighting and camera workflow. The key thing to understand is that it doesn't take that much more effort than the previously poorly lit renders. So with that, let's get into how to light our 3D models. For this tutorial, I will be using Maya 2020.4 and V-Ray 5, but these workflows can be applied to any 3D software and any render engine. So here we are in Maya, and you can see I have no lights or anything really set up, so I'll be showing you how to build this from scratch, with the hopes that you can apply these principles and workflows to your own toolset. So the first thing that you want to do is find your reference and inspiration. Here are a few things and a few examples of what I found online. I follow a few of these guys on ArtStation and Instagram. Color Sponge has some really nice 3D models, and I really like his approach to lighting. So I'll be using that as quite a bit of inspiration here for the tutorial. And you can see he has other examples. Now, one of the things that you want to understand is head to ArtStation and just find some examples that really stick out to you and that are a good example of lighting. And the reason why I like these examples, this one is by Max. And the key thing here is that looking at this model and this excavator, you can tell that he didn't really have to use a very complex lighting scenario. And that's what my hope is here today. And what I plan to show you is you can achieve these results without having to complicate the lighting workflows. Here's another one. So I'm going to butcher your name, but it's right here, Salim. So I'll be using these kinds of my main inspiration. I have them collected in my mood board, and you can kind of see what I have here. Not only do you want to find 3D and CG reference, but it really helps to understand how lighting works in a real photo studio setup. You don't have to do crazy deep research, but understanding how things are put together and the tools that they use will translate directly over from a lighting standpoint and photography standpoint. At the end of the day, you can see that they really don't have that many lights in here. So we don't have to create complex lighting scenarios, especially when just showing off the key features here of our models. And I also want to thank Rohan 3D. He went ahead and sent me his legendary assault rifle, which I plan to use for this tutorial towards the end when I do a time-lapse lighting of kind of how to light different props. So I'll be showing how to take this entire workflow and apply it to a completely different prop. All right, so now that we have our reference, our inspiration, we're ready to go with setting up everything inside of Maya and your 3D software. What I always see a lot is people skip this first part, which before even setting up really your light or even your background, is you want to set up your camera composition. And by doing this, it's going to dictate everything else down the road with our background, with our lights, and so on and so forth. I will go ahead and just create a new camera, and I'll just call this render cam. And with this camera, you can see if I start to position it, it looks okay. But one of the things right off the bat is we want to change what's called the focal length. The focal length here, you can see if I zoom it up real high to something like 100, 180, it reduces the amount of distortion in the lens. And if I go to the opposite extreme to maybe something like 25 and zoom in, you can see what's starting to happen, and we're getting more distortion. Now, sometimes you want to be a little bit artistic and creative when creating kind of more of these artistic shots. But for what we're trying to create, we're trying to showcase our model. That's the most important thing here. And we want to be able to show our models with the minimum amount of distortion. So with this, I'll end up using a higher focal length. At minimum, I would recommend at least starting with 50 and going up, or we can see what 100 does. And I end up liking around 100 and 120. Going up to 200, I would probably never have to go higher than something like 200. And it starts to become very, very orthographic. But something like 120 will work perfectly fine. And you can see just by simply framing this with a better focal length, the model instantly looks better versus the 35 here, where you can see that the front end really starts to bow out. And by the front end bowing out like this, towards the end of the camera where the distortion is going to happen, it makes the rear look a lot smaller, right? And that's what's causing that distortion, and it makes the shot look unbalanced. So if we have something like 120, it really, really holds everything together. And you can see how good the vehicle looks. And with this better focal length, I can go ahead and position this to get kind of a more balanced stance here. So I want to make sure that I have all four wheels showing. So something like this. And then what I can do is bring in our backdrop. And I'll go ahead and bring in this cyclorama that I have, this kind of infinite background. It's always a good thing once you have this in position that you want to show your frame padding. So here, or your resolution gate with your gate mask here. So that way you know exactly what's going to be in the shot. For example, without this, I would maybe be zoomed in a little bit too close or zoomed in too far, and I really wouldn't know the ultimate composition for this. So always use something like a resolution gate and gate mask, and keep in mind that your resolution is going to be very, very important in your aspect ratio. If I was rendering something square, for example, that changes quite a bit. You can see that I have a lot more space top to bottom. In this case, for this example, I will be just using standard HD with 540, rendering at 960 by 540 with the HD aspect ratio. All right, so I like what I have here, and you can play around with different positions, typically to get a more impressive or intimidating, or really show off your scale of your model. Bring the camera down like this. That really helps put it in place, and again helps ground the vehicle. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit just so the ends aren't going to be butting up against the shot here. So I'm just holding Alt right click, so Alt and right click drag. So I like this. You can also use something like this, which is called the field chart, to kind of get it like nicely set up and even. This should give me pretty much exactly what I need. I like this. And what I can do then is go to view and then set up what's called a bookmark here by going to bookmarks, edit bookmark, and then you can hit new. And that way, just in case you bump your camera, you can just double click and set it back there. Or if you move your camera, you can hit Alt Z and that'll put that back in position. Or you can simply lock your camera in position and that won't move it throughout the duration that you're working. But just keep in mind the bookmarks are really nice just so you don't move that down the road. All right, so we have our vehicle in position and you can see what type of backdrop that I have here. And I actually wanted to show you guys a few. I've used every single one of these for different types of shots and different types of renders, including your traditional plane, which you can simply do by just extruding a plane up. And you can see if I set smooth face, this is all this is, literally just a smooth plane up to 3 divisions. That gives me what I want. Or I've done half domes like this, works really nicely, which this is just a really smooth sphere with a beveled or chamfered edge radius here, just to get that smooth gradient that we see. Another one that I've used is a simple half cube like this, where it's just kind of this inverted cube like so. And this gives you kind of this opening. You'll notice that all of these shots have openings to kind of help bring in more light, depending on your background, which I will talk about later. And we want to avoid something like this. Now you can use this in combination with kind of a fall off gradient backdrop, so that's okay too. But for now, I'm going to use this cyclorama. And the way to create this is, I was taking a look online and I saw a nice example from Josh Gamble, who showed kind of how he created this real simple in Blender. And I'll do it real quick in Maya, which is very simple. You just create a plane and scale this up. And I don't want any subdivisions here. And I can just take these two edges, press W for move, hold shift and move that up. So you get something like this. And once I do that, I can select this middle edge here and do a bevel and give this like a ton of segments. You can go like 50, 60, it doesn't really matter. So you get something really smooth like that. Then you can select the edge here along the bottom and then also bevel that one. So you'll kind of double bevel that and add in again something like 50. Oops, not depth, but segments. And there you go. So you get what's called this kind of infinite backdrop based off of what's called a cyclorama. So this will give you this, again, really nice backdrop, looks really good, and I already have one set up. What I also do is move the pivot here on the ground. So that way I can scale and move this as needed. And you can always see that it will stay to the ground here. You want to make sure that the vehicle is about as close to the ground, touching basically, or just barely clipping here. So that way you get nice ground shadows. All right. So this is what we have so far. We have this nice camera set up here. We have our cyclorama infinite backdrop set up. And then now we can get into lighting. I also want to confirm, or at least review the materials here, which I'm using standard V-Ray materials that can easily be translated to any render engine with a simple, I would say a little bit lighter than mid-gray, white reflection color. And I'm using roughness here, which translates to most render engines or almost all. And I'm using about 0.7, which I can change and show you the differences. And then for this vehicle, you can see that I have something similar, but we want differing values here, so they'll pop. Okay, so I will modify those materials as we go along, but let's go ahead now and start lighting this model. What I want to do first is bring over my render settings. We are using V-Ray, but I'm going to switch this to V-Ray GPU, and I'm going to enable RTX since I have a recently purchased RTX 3090, which is going to help with render times and iteration times. Otherwise, I have an old Intel. It's a i7 5600K, something like that. So that has been working fine and iterates fast with the progressive render, but I will be using V-Ray GPU with RTX here. And light cache, 5,000 subdivs is fine. GI is on, and I will be using denoiser, right? Which are all things that you can use in any render engine, whether you're using Arnold, Blender Cycles, so on and so forth. So with that, I'm going to start the IPR render. I won't be using the V-Ray frame buffer IPR. Instead, I'm going to use the viewport IPR. The only thing that's annoying about this is it doesn't work with the resolution gate, but this will be fine for blocking in and getting our lighting set up. So now that that's running, I will bump this up quite a bit. And there we are. So where is our camera? This is really important. Our camera is right over here. You can't really see it. So I'm going to increase the locator scale so we know the position of our camera. And since we know the position of our camera, we can now better position our light. All right. So now that we have that, we have render cam here. I'm going to move this back and off to the right of the camera, where we want most of this illumination, or our key illumination, happening along the body of this vehicle. Now, here are things that you need to understand when it comes to lighting is the intensity. So if I hit Control A, the intensity of the light matters, the size of the light matters, and the direction and the position that the light is positioned matters as well. For example, this all matters for shadows and how soft the light is. If I have a really small light, meaning I go 10 by 10, but I have an intensity multiplier of like 1,000, look how hard and sharp our shadows start to look, right? If I move my camera here, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm going to get this so you can see this a little bit better. Now, the further away the shadow is, the harder the shadow is going to look. So I can increase this again so you can really see how sharp that is. And I can bring that up. Now, this works well if you want something like hard shadows on your render. If that's the direction you want to go, you can. I will be using these again as the inspiration for my renders, and these are much softer looking reflections and softer looking shadows. So with that, I'm going to use a much larger light. Again, this is why this reference is really good, because in order to get soft shadows like this, you need a large light. So with that, I'm going to significantly reduce the intensity. We want a larger light that's a lot lower in intensity. So I will set this now to 250, maybe by 100. So we get this kind of soft box effect here. And we get that. And what I will do is put this back into position based off my camera. And this is what we have right now. All right, so we can see how this is looking, and it's coming together nicely. Now, if I wanted, now that I have the light set up, and let's say I want to see more of this ground, this is where I can make that decision, right? I can start to rotate my camera up just a little bit, so I start to see more of the ground and pick up more of that shadow. This should be fine for right now. I know for a fact that I will be lighting from this angle here. So I will call this light my key light, and this is my main key directional light that I have coming off of the camera. Now, you do want to avoid putting the key light behind the camera because that makes your renders look very flat. You can see here we aren't getting a lot of shadows, and it just again makes the render look very flat. So never put your key light directly behind the camera. Instead, put it off to the side. You can see how that already immediately makes it look much better and more interesting. Now that I have that, what I most of the time, almost always, is I will take this light, Control D to duplicate it, and I'll move this up above directly on top of our vehicle model here. So I'll end up using kind of these transforms here, and I'll just rotate this where it's perfectly flat and make sure that this is right on top. So now we have this top light, which could be a type of fill light, but this top light is going to really help bring out the reflections, bring out the details, bring out the highlights, and make everything look really good. Now, if you start to notice that this key side is looking good, our top side is looking good, but the front grille here is a little bit dark, that's where a fill light is going to be very helpful. Now, when it comes to these top lights and key lights, or non-key lights, I should say, you do want the intensities to be a little bit lower, or a bit lower than your key light, since the key light is your main directional illumination source, right? So I will now grab the top light with about half intensity, it's about 5 intensity, Control D to duplicate that, and I will rotate this in position. And maybe something like this, where we get this kind of behind the camera, and we can see how that's bringing in a little bit of light for the front. And if I just call this fill, I will disable that, and look what that does to the front here. It's really, really helping quite a bit, right? Once I add in that fill light, and it's just this big soft light, and it's not overpowering our shadows, and everything's looking really nice. Then what you can do is, once you have these main lights, I will typically mess with an arrangement or an assortment of these types of light. You can have an impact as well on your background. For example, now if I take this top light here, I'll again hit Control D to duplicate. I will move this and aim this at the background, right? This is what you see a lot in photography, where you're using, in addition to these light sources, you're using kind of these bounce cards, and it's just going to give you a very, very nice soft light effect, and it helps make the vehicle or your model pop off the background, right? So I'm going to make this even larger, so I'll probably end up going up to something like 500 by 300, and I want this primarily aimed at the background here. And you can make this softer and move it back a little bit further. Now you may have seen this chart that I had in my PureRef, and this is really important. I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands light fall off, right? So if you have a light at a certain intensity and it's 1 meter away, you get 100% of the light intensity and the light quantity. So this is the light fall off or inverse square law. And if I have a light that is, let's say, 2 meters away, it's just simply 1/2 squared, and you get 25%. So if you have something 3 meters, that's 1/3 squared, 10%. Just know that it's not a 1-to-1 correlation. This is all the reason I wanted to show you this, is so that if you have something at a certain intensity and it moves away, maybe double the distance or quadruple the distance, you're going to go from 100% light intensity and quantity down to something like 10 or 6%. So that's why the position of the light is really important. That's why I can take this very, very large, soft light and start to really move it away, or bring it in closer, and it's going to have a direct impact, but it's not going to be a 1-to-1. So just keep that in mind as you're going through and positioning these lights, that you may have to, move them a little bit closer and move them a little bit farther away. All right. So the other thing that I want to make sure that you understand is that the larger, less intense lights that are close to the object will always lead to softer shadows, and these smaller, more intense lights will lead to harder shadows, to recap from the beginning. So here are my key lights, or my light setup. I have key, top, fill, and I will call this rim, or it's kind of a bounce card. And here's what we got. And I'm liking the direction that we're going. And the light is nice and soft. If I wanted to, say, make this background lighter, I can, by increasing the diffuse color. Or I can make this darker, and it'll make the vehicle pop. So it really, really depends what you're trying to achieve. Again, if we take a look, I'll be kind of going through with this kind of white on white and letting the shape of the vehicle pop off the background. I will definitely show you the dark kind of fall off, the ambient light setup that I used for the gun here, Rohan's gun. So I think this gives me what I need. So now that I have that, I'm going to stop the viewport IPR, and I'm going to do the final refinement here inside of the V-Ray frame buffer. So I will go ahead and turn on IPR and get this going. And we got this kicked on and working with the RTX, which is really nice. And we can see how fast this updates. Now, this is why I also like using what's called the light lister. The light lister is really nice. It just has all the lights here, and I have everything properly named, so I know exactly what I'm doing. And what I end up doing is also enabling what's called temperature. And this is the next thing, which is color and temperature, which is going to help give us a nice look and feel for our lighting here. So I will enable that on all of my lights here. And if I just take a look at it, for example, for our key light here, you can see that I have this temperature slider. As I increase the temperature, it becomes cooler, so the light becomes more blue. And as I lower the temperature, which is based off of Kelvins, it becomes warmer. Now, I always recommend is blending both colors, cool and warm, to give a more impactful and more interesting render, right? Now, if I know my key light here is going to be warm or cool, I'll kind of have the other lights be the opposite, right? So for example, to kind of achieve what I showed you at the beginning, I'll go for a much cooler temperature render, so things become blue, and that's looking nice. Then what I can do is my other lights, so you can see this is my key light, and I can hit this little icon here. So my fill light now, I can say, you know what, I want my fill light, or the front end, to be warmer. So I can bring down that temperature about 45. So now you're getting this nice warm front end blending into this nice cool side with our key light. And then we can select our top light here. And this top light, we can have that also be cool. So if we go ahead and move this over, something like this. So we have this nice cool, but now we're starting to get a little bit too much cool. And that's where our fill light on our back, right? I can have that, or I guess the fill light was behind it. Or no, sorry, we have the rim light. And the rim light can be the warm light behind it. Okay? And yeah, so then we get something like this, right? Where we're starting to get this nice lighting here. Now I do want to recommend is don't light with color correction. I did have the color correction on the whole time, but you do not want to be lighting with tone mapping or curves. So just make sure that's off. Anything post can be added at the end. So here's where we're at. So we get this nice cool front end. We get this warm background, and it's going to help this vehicle really pop off and look really nice. Now, from a material standpoint, of course, whatever you're trying to look for, let's say you select this material here and it's this clay, you can make this lighter material as needed. For the vehicle body, you can make it darker, or you can kind of go the opposite route, make it a little bit lighter, and I select the background here, and I can make this a little bit darker for the background, just so that the vehicle pops off a little bit more. All right. So color temperature is going to be really important to help get just these nice renders that are really subtle. And the key thing I also want to bring up, the next tip, is going to be light balance. So make sure that your lights aren't too overexposed and too intense. So for example, like if I use the default value here for this key light, take a look at what it's doing. I mean, this is kind of extreme, but even at like 20, it really starts to brighten up the vehicle and is really clipping, right? And we're losing all the detail. So that's where lighting and balance is very important. I'll end up just going back to the 10 value that I had. Maybe if you want this to be, there's nothing wrong with brighter highlights, so I can maybe bump this up to something like 12. And we have something that looks good, that looks clean, and this front end of this vehicle is really popping off of this background. And of course, remember, like, you can move the background here closer or further away, right? As if I move this further away, take a look at what that's doing right here with our render. Oops, didn't mean to do that, right? So it's pushing it further off, and we get more of this darker background. As it comes closer, we get more of that infinity background, where it has a direct look or direct impact on how the vehicle looks, depending on the position of the background. Okay, now there are other things you can do for sure, right? So I wanted to keep this simple with just kind of these 2 to 3, 2 to 4 lights here. And for, something more interesting or just different for that matter, you can go online and find HDRIs. So I found this one from Polyhaven, this Shudu Lake, and I just downloaded it as an HDRI, and I can bring this in, bring this dome in here, use dome texture, and I will load the HDRI, and I can use that in combination with what I have. So I will bring this Shudu Lake in here, and you can kind of see the impact that that has, and it gives us this kind of nice, kind of this good ambient lighting. And you can of course rotate this in position. I had to end up rotating it, I think about 120, where the direct light source was something like that. Now it is a bit intense. You can see, we're now getting clipped lighting here. So I'd want to select this dome and use or lower my intensity. Now the one thing I do want to bring up is that I typically use what's called physical camera exposure, but because I'm not using that, I don't want to overcomplicate this tutorial. We'll just stick to lighting, and I can maybe cover that in a later tutorial. So for now, I'll just have to reduce the light impact and intensities that we have here. Along with dome lights, you can also use something like a procedural light, like a V-Ray sun or a sun and sky. So I'll turn off the dome light, and I will create the sun in the sky. Now again, because I don't have exposure settings, I have to select the light, kind of position this something like this, and I have to lower the intensity drastically, maybe something like 0.01. Now these weird shadows here are simply from our V-Ray lights, so I have to set them to invisible so they do not cast shadows, and there you go. You can see I have to go even lower, maybe 0.005. We get something like that. Now if I do that, I'm getting a lot of warmth from the sun, and I can also increase the size multiplier, and you can do all sorts of things to really get some nice looking and nice interesting lighting here. All right, so I just wanted to make sure to kind of show you guys you can combine this with V-Ray dome lights, or you can combine this with dome lights and procedural sun lights and get just as interesting results. Now I will go ahead and remove the environments, V-Ray sun and sky, and I'll just leave the dome light off for now. And this is kind of where I'm ending up. So you can kind of see if I stop this, this is where I ended up previously. So I went kind of in the opposite direction with warmer light, or excuse me, cooler light, and then I went with the warmer light here. So I'll do a final recap on what I did for the gun model right now. All right, so here I am setting up Rohan's model. I'm putting this clay material on the gun, and I'm positioning my camera. So I know that I wanted that long focal length to really show off the shape and the detail of this gun, so I didn't want a lot of distortion. End up using about 100 focal length here. And then I start positioning my lights. I add in my key light, and I go for a large softbox style light because I want nice soft shadows. But for this time, I kept the lights positions a little bit higher to have shallower shadows. Then I had this top-down light, which is probably one of my favorite lights. And you'll see that I actually ended up experimenting quite a bit here. I wasn't sure if I wanted to use all 4 lights. I wasn't sure if I wanted to use the V-Ray sun. But I took a look at some reference and inspiration. And typically when you see weapons, they are really showcasing this kind of dark void. So the 100% focus is the gun that themselves. So then I set up a V-Ray sun, a dome light. I didn't like the direction that was going, so I ended up just nixing that. I wanted you to kind of see my work process and my work iteration here. So I'm going back and forth, and then I end up just, again, nixing it. I disabled them completely. And I knew, again, I wanted to keep that dark void background, so I pushed the background further off in the distance. And then I start finalizing. And I start finalizing and do the final color grading and retouching. So here is the final gun model that I ended up rendering. And you can see that I had a few iterations and a few things to test out, but all I ended up using was this key light and this top light. So I decided to disregard essentially all the other lights. So I can just straight up delete those. And you can see that this is where I ended up. And of course, once you're happy with the lighting, you push it even further with a curves adjustment and then use tone mapping, and it pops really, really well. This nice white gun over the black background, and so the complete focus is the gun itself. And this top-down light is really just helping making the entire length of the gun pop and look good. And you can add other lights if you wanted to, but this is what I felt like all I needed to really showcase and show off this gun. So it turned out really, really nice with this simple lighting setup with just these two main lights. This one key light here and this one top light with this background that I ended up pushing further back to get more of this black void look. And then I ended up darkening the ground, giving it a little bit of shine, and it all came together at the very end. So here we are with the final conclusion and wrap up. And I did want to emphasize that once you have this really nice lighting setup that's ready to go, that's when you go through and do your color grading and curves adjustments. So at minimum, I always add a nice curves adjustment, which is going to darken the darks. So you can see here, as I increase this curve adjustment here, it lightens the lights and darkens the darks, right? So it just helps push that contrast. You can see it's a bit subtle. And then V-Ray Frame Buffer added what's called filmic tone mapping, which is really nice. And I ended up just using Power Curve. I believe Hable is the default. So I ended up really going for something that was just kind of that poppy and really contrasty look to really help show off the details of the model. So definitely do not forget about color grading, curves adjustments, tone mapping. It really just helps push your models, right? Because without this, you can see what it looks like. Looks good. I liked where I ended up with the lighting, but I knew, all right, I'm going to push this a little bit further with tone mapping and color grading. All right. And that's where I ended up with these. So again, I knew I wanted this white on white and this white on black here for this kind of this gun model that I used here. So two different styles, but I wanted to make sure that you saw how I was able to achieve that. So I know this was probably a little bit longer, but I wanted to make sure to really touch base on all the things that I keep in mind when lighting 3D models. And I really hope that you guys benefit from this so you can go from renders that look like this to renders that look like this. A like and subscribe is always appreciated as I continue to grow the content of this channel. And let me know down below, what do you want me to cover next? I've definitely got some ideas for some new tutorials, but I'm always open to suggestions and feedback. Good luck everyone, stay safe, and I'll see you around.